So thanks very much for letting me have a few minutes of your time. I'm Val Tollefson. I'm currently the president of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial Association. I expect that most, if not all of you, have visited the memorial and probably are conversant with the story, but at the risk of at the possibility of there being one person that doesn't know it, I'll tell you that the memorial has been or is being built in memory and honor of those Japanese American Bainbridge Islanders who were excluded from their homes in March, the end of March 1942, sent to concentration camps for 4.5 years or so. And the way this came about was in the late 1990s, the mayor of Bainbridge Island, who at the time was Dwight Sutton, convened a task force to make recommendations as to what might be done with the Wyckoff Superfund site, which is the current location of Pritchard Park. And this task force was the second task force that had been convened on the same subject. One, a couple of years earlier, had come up with a recommendation that that the Superfund site be developed commercially, and that it would be a great location for some maritime activities on the shore and condominiums and shops and one thing and another. And apparently that idea didn't sit too well with Dwight, or he had concerns about it. I know that there were some issues with the trustee that owned the property at the time. And so he convened another task force, and I was on that task force along with Sally Marin and Ed Kushner and a number of other islanders. And after some consideration, we came to the conclusion that the best thing for Bainbridge Island would be if instead of developing this, it could be turned into a park. The trustee was willing to sell the property, but he wanted $20 million for it, which we didn't have in our pocket. And so after some time, we were able to actually get a new trustee appointed who had a more community-minded approach to how this might work, and agreed to sell it to us for $8 million. In the early 2000s, we launched a campaign to raise that money. And the money came from individuals on the island, individuals interested in the story of the Japanese Americans on the island. A substantial amount of money came from the county, the state, the city, and the federal government. And the federal government money came with strings attached, and the strings were that it should be used to acquire and develop a memorial to the Exclusion on the west part of the property, which was the location of the Eagle Harbor ferry dock, or Eagledale ferry dock, in 1942. That's at the road end of Taylor Avenue. So that kind of got the ball rolling. The impetus for the idea that there should be a physical memorial came from some discussions that the Interfaith Council of Kitsap County had, and they actually made a suggestion to a couple of the leaders of the Japanese American community including Frank Kitamoto and Junko Harui and Ron, I think, Nakata. But anyway, the money came from the federal government. The property was acquired, and in the mid 2000s, a committee of the Japanese American Bainbridge Island Japanese American community started planning an actual memorial. In 2008, that committee was spun off into what is now the Memorial Association, and design of the site got well underway. I guess you could give me the next slide, if you will. So this is, on the left is a photograph of the day that the March 30th, 1942, when the islanders were actually taken off the island. And this shows in the background a number of cars up on the hill, which were largely friends of the people that were being taken away. Next slide. In the development of the idea for a memorial, we kind of came up with three elements. One was the memorial wall that currently exists, and we've got a picture of that later. The second was the idea that we would like to recreate the actual ferry dock where people were taken away. And when we first started talking with architects and with the city and other government entities about doing this, it rapidly became clear that the idea of actually building a physical dock with pilings in the water and that sort of thing was, in the current day of environmental concerns, was going to be a non-starter. So we came up with, instead of recreating the dock that you see here in this photograph, if I could have the next slide, please. Well, I'm out of order with my own story here. I'll jump ahead and then come back. So in developing the concept for the memorial, we looked around the island at the various places on the island that had Japanese American connections and drew on those places in the story of the Japanese Americans on the island and came up with the ideas for the memorial wall. And then the next slide. And one of the things that also really with Frank Kitamoto's encouragement kind of guided our thinking was that this wasn't really just a story about the Japanese Americans that were taken off the island, but it was really a Bainbridge Island story about both the Japanese Americans and the friends they left behind, and the experience that they had coming back to the island, largely being welcomed home, but with some significant community resistance initially. And so all of that kind of guided the development. Next picture. So we came up with this master plan. This is actually a current version of the plan, but we were talking about three phases of development. In the top of the picture there, you can see the memorial wall that currently exists and was completed in 2011. Then on the right, the little rectangle there is what we're now calling the departure deck. And this is what we're currently constructing. we started the development application process for this part of the project in 2016. And we finally got a permit, a building permit, in April of this year. We went out to bid, and we have a contractor, Clark Construction, and Clark Construction has started work. This deck is 11 feet wide, 40 or 41 feet long. It's designed to be cantilevered over the bank by about 11 feet. So once it's completed, we hope that it will kind of evoke the idea of the ferry dock that existed, even though it's not a dock, but rather simply a deck. The final phase of the hope for development of the memorial site, you see kind of in the bottom center with some green highlights, and that's a relatively small, what we're calling a visitor center, with on the left of it a little amphitheater, outside amphitheater for outside presentations and meetings of tour groups. And we are currently working with Jones & Jones Architects for final plans for this phase, which we hope to get permitted in the next year or so. And again, hopefully financing, permitting, start construction in 2023. Next picture. The entire memorial site, the wall, the deck, and the planned visitor center all have been designed by Jones & Jones Architects. John Paul Jones, for those of you who don't know, is a Bainbridge Island resident. He is one of the Jones of Jones & Jones. And John Paul is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. He is a designer of the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and a number of other nationally famous memorials of one sort or another. He has been donating an immense amount of his own time on this project, which without which this would not have happened. So you're now looking at the pavilion that currently exists on the site. This structure was designed by John Paul Jones in coordination with John Bidet, who's a member of our board, longtime member of our board, and a skilled woodworker. John is a member of the National Timber Framers group, and I can't remember the year now, but at one point the Timber Framers had their national convention on Bainbridge Island. They all converged on the island, lived in homes around the island, and built this structure, which they donated to the memorial site. Next photograph. One of our partners in the memorial is the National Park Service. The memorial is now designated as a National Historic Site. It is administratively kind of a subdivision of the Minidoka National Historic Site in Idaho, which is the concentration camp where most of the Bainbridge Islanders eventually ended up and spent the war. So the National Park Service has contributed a lot of design services in the storytelling part of this, such as these waysides, and staffs the site with a ranger during the summer months so that visitors can actually have somebody to talk to whenever they show up. Next slide. And this, of course, is the memorial wall as it exists now. Looking north across Eagle Harbor, and obviously at the very end of what you see in this picture is where we're now constructing the departure deck. Next slide. So one thing that Reed mentioned people were interested in was what the impact of all this is on people who might want to visit the site. And the fact is that except there may be a day or two when heavy equipment in the parking lot precludes any use. Right now, the memorial is open, consistent with precautions of COVID-19, but the only problem is that you won't be able to experience the very last section of the memorial wall because the contractor has it blocked off so they can work down there, and you won't be able to, next slide please. You won't be able to come into the memorial from the back gate, which is also blocked off. So the memorial is open, the pavilion is open. You can come down and experience the memorial wall, and you can lock your fingers through the fencing and watch the construction, but you can't get to the end of the wall. Next slide. We started excavation last Friday. The excavation, the construction of the wall is pretty simple. The deck, it's going to be supported on the north side, the side closest to the water, by two structures called pin piles. And so it's necessary that we dig some big holes down there to put in those pin piles. And the first hole got dug, and the contractor looked in the hole, and lo and behold, it appeared as though there were some shells in the excavation. This is, as are all shorelines on Bainbridge Island, is an area of historical and cultural significance to the Squamish tribe. And one of the conditions of our being allowed to build this deck is that we have to be cognizant if we run into any evidence of any human habitation. The presence of shells in one of the levels of the excavation raised the question of whether or not this was some kind of a site that needed more preservation, and so construction stopped almost as soon as it started. Over the weekend, we were able to coordinate with the National Park Service, who sent an archaeologist on Monday, and that's the archaeologist down there in the pink, I think. Next slide, please. She got down in the hole and started digging in the dirt. And yes, there are some shells, but it doesn't look on initial, her initial look, it doesn't look like it is necessarily what's called a shell midden, which would mean some particular significance. She thought it was, what she was seeing was equally possible that a river otter had crawled up there with a stomach full of oysters and died. We're going to restart construction on Friday, but it's going to be with monitoring by the National Park archaeology people as we dig a second hole and sift through the dirt that we've already dug up to make sure that there aren't any artifacts that require further examination. But right now we're optimistic. If we get that second hole dug successfully, the contractor is telling us that this whole project should take 4 or 5 weeks. So by Thanksgiving, we may have a deck. Next slide, please. And so we get the departure deck built. We have a committee working on what we call the interpretive elements of the deck. It's not going to be just a deck like you put a table on in a barbecue. We want it to have some historical and emotional tie to the events that the memorial celebrates. And so we've got a committee working on that. We expect that there will be some artistic elements that will be added, and hopefully that'll all be conceived by the end of the year and constructed by summer of next year. So we hope. So that's what I have to tell you. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Hi, I have a question. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the groups that are continuing to work. Is the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community actively involved with the group that you're working with? And it sounds like maybe there might be other organizations that are participating in the development of these elements to keep the memorial growing.
Yeah. So when we first started out, the group that's now the association was just a committee of the Japanese American Community Organization, because their interest is broader than simply the memorial. They're interested in maintaining the historical ties of the community absent World War II experience. And obviously sponsor the Mochi Tsuki event at New Year's that I hope you all know about. So this was a big enough project that we, and by we, I mean the people that were involved in that committee, agreed that a separate organization really ought to concentrate on the memorial. So a separate nonprofit, this organization was set up, and we had kind of a loose partnership. The property at the time was owned partly by the Park District and partly jointly. The Park District and the city owned some of the property. The city was the sole owner of some of the property. The Historical Museum obviously was the repository of a lot of the physical artifacts related to this story on the island. The National Park Service, once we were successful in getting the site designated as a national historical site, National Park Service was interested. So all of these entities in the city of Bainbridge, so all of these entities in the early days had some involvement in either the design, fundraising, what was going to be permitted, how were we going to get whatever we needed to get. As things have turned out, the Park District is in the process of becoming the sole owner of the property, so the city will not have, any day now, they tell us, the city will not have any further ownership interest. And so right now we have active coordination, cooperation between the Park District, the Historical Museum, the Japanese American community, and the National Park Service. They're all working on this.